Hey folks, welcome back to WTF History, where we rip the veil off the past and dive into the stories that make your jaw drop and your heart ache. Today, we're stepping into a world so dark, so twisted, it's hard to believe it was real, but it was, and it claimed thousands of lives. Picture this, it's 1228 and you're 7 years old, standing in the shadowy corridor of St. Agatha's convent in northern France. The air is heavy with the scent of damp stone and melting wax. Candlelight flickers across walls carved with saints, their faces locked in eternal suffering, staring down at you with hollow eyes. In your small hands, you clutch a wooden doll, the last gift from a mother you'll never see again. The other children shuffle past, silent as ghosts, their heads shaved, their feet bare against the freezing stone floor. Their eyes, God, their eyes, carry a weight no child should bear, a knowledge that cuts deeper than any blade. You don't know it yet, but in a few hours, everything you believe about safety, about love, about being a kid, is about to be shattered. This is the story of medieval convents. Places that were supposed to be sanctuaries, but operated as some of history's most horrific child abuse networks. Buckle up, because this one's going to be a gut punch. Let's set the scene. It's the High Middle Ages, and the Catholic Church isn't just a spiritual guide. It's the ultimate power, controlling everything from your soul to your coin purse. Across Europe, from the misty valleys of England to the sunlit hills of Italy, an estimated 40,000 children vanished into what the church called houses of spiritual education between 1100 and 1500. These weren't schools or holy havens. They were machines designed to consume childhood itself, chewing up kids as young as 4 and spitting out broken shells, if they survived at all. The survival rate to adulthood was less than 30%. Most didn't make it past 18 months before death, madness, or total psychological collapse claimed them. These aren't wild guesses. They come from Vatican archives, unsealed in 1998, though even those records only capture what the church bothered to write down. The real number is likely higher, buried in unmarked graves or lost to history's selective amnesia. Our guide through this nightmare is Marguerite, a 7-year-old girl who walked into St. Agatha's in 1228, clutching that wooden doll. Her story isn't unique. Tens of thousands shared her fate, but it's a window into the horror. Marguerite's family was desperate. Her father owed taxes after a bad harvest, and her mother faced accusations of folk healing, teetering on the edge of heresy. The local priest offered a deal: give Marguerite to the convent, and their debts, spiritual and financial, will be wiped clean. It sounded like mercy, a chance to save her soul. But it was a trap. The moment she crossed the threshold, her life as Marguerite, the girl with a name and a family, ended. Her doll was taken, her golden hair shaved off, her name replaced with a number: 47. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a system perfected over centuries, designed to erase identity and crush resistance while cloaked in the sanctity of God's work. When Marguerite arrived, she entered what the records call the preparation period. It sounds like orientation, but it was a calculated assault on her sense of self. Her clothes were swapped for a rough brown tunic, marking her as convent property. She was told her possessions, even that little doll, were sinful, tying her to a worldly life she needed to abandon. The other kids, already broken by the system, whispered warnings when the nuns weren't watching. They pointed out the welts on each other's backs, the way they flinched at approaching footsteps, the black-robed figures gliding through the halls like predators. Marguerite learned fast that this place wasn't about salvation. It was about control, about profit, about appetites that hid behind prayers and crosses. The The selection process was chillingly precise. Convents didn't take just any child. Beautiful kids like Marguerite commanded higher fees from wealthy patrons. Intelligent ones were valued for tasks like record-keeping or complex chores. And then there were the physical criteria, documented in intake records with a specificity that had nothing to do with spirituality and everything to do with satisfying desires too vile to speak aloud in daylight. Over 300 convents across Europe specialized in this child ablation, linked by a network that moved kids in covered wagons to new locations when they became too recognizable or too damaged to be useful. Marguerite was ideal merchandise, young, pretty, and from a family with no leverage to fight back. Her parents thought they were giving her to God. They were selling her into a nightmare. The daily routine at St. Agatha's was a masterclass in psychological destruction. Kids weren't allowed to speak during daylight hours, ensuring they couldn't share stories or plan resistance. They bathed together under the watchful eyes of nuns, supposedly for cleanliness, but really for evaluation by patrons paying premium prices for fresh arrivals. Daily spiritual examinations in private chambers left kids silent and terrified, but the convent's ledgers recorded them as acts of religious devotion. Marguerite's first week was a crash course in survival. She saw the fear in the other kids' eyes, the way they moved like shadows, the way they shrank from the nun's touch. She heard screams at night, muffled by thick stone walls, and learned they weren't cries of spiritual ecstasy, but of suffering too deep to name. The convent's underground chambers were the heart of the horror. The lower levels had cells for isolating kids as punishment or preparation for special sessions. The middle levels were rooms where patrons conducted their business, equipped with restraints and tools that served no holy purpose. The deepest level was for disposal. Kids who died or were too broken to be useful were buried in unmarked graves, their deaths euphemistically recorded as transferred to eternal contemplation. Marguerite saw what happened to a boy named Benedict, a 12-year-old who tried to escape. His corrective spiritual discipline lasted 3 days, leaving him unable to speak or recognize his own name. The records say he was sent to permanent contemplative service. We'll get to what that really meant. What makes this so sickening is how deliberate it was. The church didn't just turn a blind eye, it built this system. Senior nuns, loyal to the cause, got access to the most profitable kids and the richest patrons. Junior nuns had to prove their loyalty by participating in punishments, ensuring their silence. Visiting clergy were treated like VIPs. Their every desire catered to, no matter how monstrous. The ledgers read like corporate accounts. Kids listed by age, appearance, and specialized training for specific patron demands. Marguerite's file, found centuries later in the Vatican archives, described her as item 47, acquired via debt forgiveness, suitable for advanced instruction, commanding premium rates due to exceptional appearance and malleable temperament. That's a 7-year-old girl reduced to a commodity. The kids developed their own ways to survive. They created a silent communication system, subtle gestures, objects left in specific places to warn each other about dangerous visitors or sadistic nuns. They taught Marguerite how to retreat into her mind, a trick they called psychological absence, to endure the worst violations while protecting a piece of her spirit. But the system was designed to make kids complicit. Those who performed well got better food, warmer blankets, or temporary protection from the worst abuses. Those who resisted were punished, and others suffered to make an example. Marguerite learned to compete with other kids for patron approval, not because she wanted to, but because it was the only way to survive. By her second month, Marguerite was changing. She stopped crying during private sessions. She learned to smile for selections, to thank patrons for their attention, to beg forgiveness for existing. The convent wasn't just breaking her. It was reprogramming her into a living doll, existing only for others' desires. And the worst was yet to come. During the winter solstice of 1228 ST, Agatha's held a celebration for its top patrons disguised as a religious festival. Marguerite was chosen as the main offering, an honor that would destroy what little was left of her. The event was a grotesque blend of religious pageantry and systematic violation, with kids dressed as angels performing hymns while patrons moved among them, picking their prey. Marguerite's role was to embody innocence being consecrated, a symbolic act that turned horrifyingly literal. This isn't just a story. It's a warning about what happens when power goes unchecked and innocence is commodified. The medieval church was untouchable. Its convents a black hole where kids like Marguerite disappeared. But this system wasn't built in a vacuum. It thrived because it served the powerful, and it was designed to keep running smoothly, no matter the cost. The machine that swallowed Marguerite was no accident. It was a masterpiece of institutional evil, polished over centuries to maximize profit and minimize accountability. Imagine a network stretching across Europe, from the foggy moors of England to the bustling ports of Italy, with over 300 convents linked like nodes in a sinister web. These places weren't isolated. They were connected, sharing resources, information, and, most chillingly, children. Kids were moved in covered wagons, their destinations a mystery even to the drivers. This wasn't chaos. It was logistics, a supply chain for human lives, refined to keep the horrors hidden while the money flowed. The economic engine was brutally efficient. The church had families in a chokehold. Taxes, tithes, and the threat of eternal damnation were constant pressures. For a poor family like Marguerite's, giving up a child was often the only way to avoid ruin. Priests pitched it as a sacred act. Send your kid to serve God, and your debts, spiritual or financial, would be forgiven. In reality, the convent got free labor, upfront payments, and the ability to resell trained kids to wealthy households or patrons. A single child could bring in the equivalent of 5 years' peasant wages. And the church hierarchy wasn't just complicit, they were the architects. Bishops and cardinals wrote letters endorsing the practice, framing it as a path to salvation while counting the coins. The patrons were the fuel that kept this machine humming. These weren't shadowy figures. They were the elite, the pillars of medieval society. The Vatican archives, unsealed in 1998, contained patron lists that read like a directory of power: kings, nobles, high-ranking clergy, merchants, even scholars. One name stands out: Cardinal Philippe de Montlaire, a titan in the French church. His letters to Saint Agatha's Mother Superior, Agnes, are a window into the horror. He refers to kids by number, not name, and details payment schedules for services. One letter praises item 47, Marguerite, for her development, and includes a bonus for exceptional service. This was a man of God, folks, and he wasn't an outlier. The system thrived because the most powerful people in Europe were invested in it, their wealth and influence ensuring its survival. The daily routine at St. Agatha's was a relentless grind of fear and control. It started before dawn with morning purification, a ritual that was anything but holy. Kids were woken by clanging bells and plunged into ice-cold water baths, the shock keeping them in a constant state of vulnerability. Then came confessions of sins they supposedly committed in their sleep. Imaginary crimes that reinforced their sense of guilt. Couldn't think of sin? You be punished. And your suffering was a lesson for the others. The silence rule during daylight hours kept kids from bonding or plotting. Supervised baths were for evaluation, not cleanliness, with nuns and patrons assessing kids like livestock. Private spiritual examinations left kids withdrawn and terrified, but the ledgers called it devotion. The staff hierarchy was as calculated as the rest. Senior nuns, like Mother Superior Agnes, had proven their loyalty and got access to the most profitable kids and patrons. Junior nuns had to earn their place by participating in punishments, tying their futures to the convent secrets. Visiting clergy were treated like royalty, their desires fulfilled no matter how depraved. The record-keeping was meticulous, almost corporate. Each child had a file detailing their physical and psychological state, their skills, and patron preferences. Marguerite's file noted her malleable temperament, a polite way of saying she was easy to break. These weren't kids to them. They were inventory, tracked like goods in a warehouse. The underground chambers were where the real horror unfolded. The lower levels had cells for kids who resisted or needed preparation for special sessions. The middle levels were rooms for patrons, equipped with restraints and tools that served no religious purpose. The deepest level was for disposal. Kids who died or were too broken were buried in unmarked graves, their deaths recorded as eternal contemplation. Benedict, the boy who tried to escape, faced 3 days of discipline that left him a shell. The records say he was sent to permanent contemplative service, but we know what that means. He was gone, his body likely in one of those graves. The kids try to protect each other, and that's what breaks my heart. They developed a silent language, hand signals, objects left in specific spots to warn of danger. Avoid that priest. Stay away from that nun after dark. They taught Marguerite how to go absent, to retreat into her mind during the worst moments. But the system was designed to crush even that. Rewards for compliance, better food, a blanket pitted kids against each other. Punishments for resistance hurt everyone. Marguerite learned to compete for patron approval because it meant a sliver of safety. By her second month, she was performing tasks designed to emphasize her vulnerability, serving wine with grace, singing hymns in specific poses, learning massage techniques for elderly nuns. We know what that really meant. The winter solstice event was the system's pinnacle of cruelty. It was sold as a religious festival, but it was a showcase for patrons. Kids were trained for weeks to perform rituals that blended worship with violation. Marguerite, chosen as the main offering, was dressed as an angel, singing hymns while patrons circled. Her role was to embody innocence being consecrated, a sick euphemism for what really happened. She had to thank each patron, beg for their attention, and endure their blessings. The other kids watched, knowing their turn was coming. It was psychological annihilation, cloaked in holy robes. The system was built to last because it served the powerful. Cardinal Phipe's letters show how deep it went. He'd specify which kids he wanted, how he wanted them prepared, and how much he'd pay. The patron lists include names that shaped medieval Europe. People who built cathedrals, funded crusades, and wrote laws. Their involvement wasn't a secret. It was protected. The kids' religious status made them untouchable. Sacred in theory, but disposable in practice. The machine kept turning, fueled by greed and immunity. The deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that this system wasn't just about individual cruelty. It was about control, about turning kids like Marguerite into tools for a machine that served the powerful. The medieval church wasn't just a religious institution. It was a political and economic empire, and convents like St. Agatha's were its dark engine rooms. Every detail, from the selection of kids to the daily routines, was designed to maximize profit while maintaining a facade of holiness. Marguerite's story shows us how it worked, step by horrifying step, and how it broke not just her body, but her spirit. When Marguerite arrived at St. Agatha's, the preparation period was her first taste of the convent's true nature. It wasn't about welcoming her, it was about dismantling her. Her wooden doll, her last link to her mother, was burned in a spiritual naming ceremony. They called her Marguerite of Vanity, a sin that separated her from God. She was renamed Penitenta, a name that reduced her to a symbol of perpetual atonement for crimes she never committed. Her clothes were replaced with a coarse tunic, her golden hair shaved off, not for humility, but to strip away her identity and make her vulnerable to the patron's preferences. The other kids whispered warnings. Avoid the locked chambers under the chapel. Watch out for the priests who lingered too long. Listen for the screams at night. Marguerite learned fast that this wasn't a place of love. It was a place of predation. The psychological warfare was relentless. The nuns told Marguerite her family didn't want her, that they'd paid the convent to take her away because she was a burden. They showed her forged letters, supposedly from her parents, expressing relief at being rid of her. Imagine being 7 and believing that. The prohibition against speaking her family's names was enforced with punishments, beatings, starvation, isolation, until even thinking of her mother brought pain. The goal was to sever every tie to her past, to make her believe she was nothing without the convent. She was taught her every breath was a debt to the church, a privilege they could revoke at any moment. Physical control was just as brutal. Keeping kids barefoot in winter wasn't about spiritual discipline. It kept them weak, compliant, easier to control. Regular health examinations by visiting physicians weren't about care. They were about assessing kids for suitability for patrons. The intake records are explicit. Convents prioritized kids who met specific physical criteria, not for God, but for the appetites of those paying the bills. Marguerite's file noted her exceptional appearance, a quality that made her valuable in a system that commodified beauty. The daily routine was a grind of fear and submission. Morning purification started with those ice-cold baths, shocking kids into a state of constant vulnerability. Then came confessions of imaginary sins, dreams, thoughts, anything to reinforce their guilt. Couldn't confess enough? You'd face public punishment, a warning to the others. The silence rule kept kids from forming bonds or planning resistance. Supervised baths were for evaluation, with nuns and patrons assessing kids' bodies. Private spiritual examinations were the worst. Kids came back changed, quiet, broken. The ledgers called it religious dedication, but it was abuse, plain and simple. The staff were trapped in their own way. Junior nuns had to participate in punishments to prove their loyalty, tying their silence to their survival. Senior nuns, like Mother Superior Agnes, were the gatekeepers, managing the most valuable kids and patrons. Visiting clergy were treated like gods, their desires fulfilled no matter how vile. The hierarchy ensured complicity at every level. No one could speak out without implicating themselves. The record-keeping was chillingly efficient. Each child's file detailed their physical development, psychological state, and specialized skills. Marguerite's file called her suitable for advanced instruction, a euphemism for the worst kinds of abuse. The underground chambers were the system's dark heart. The lower levels had cells for kids who resisted or needed preparation. The middle levels were for patrons with rooms equipped for acts that had nothing to do with faith. The deepest level was for disposal. Kids who died or were too broken were buried in unmarked graves, their deaths recorded as eternal contemplation. Benedict's fate was a warning to Marguerite and the others. His attempt to escape ended in 3 days of torture, leaving him unable to speak or recognize his name. He was gone, his body likely in one of those graves. The kids fought back in small ways. Their silent communication system, gestures, objects left in specific places, was a lifeline. They warned Marguerite which priests to avoid, which nuns were cruel, which areas were dangerous after dark. They taught her psychological absence, a way to retreat into her mind during the worst moments. But the system was designed to erode even that. Rewards for compliance, better food, a blanket created dependency. Punishments for resistance hurt everyone. Marguerite learned to perform tasks that emphasized her vulnerability, serving wine with grace, singing hymns in specific poses, learning massage techniques for elderly nuns. The truth was uglier. By her second month, Marguerite was a shadow of herself. She stopped crying during private sessions. She smiled for selections, thanked patrons for their attention, begged forgiveness for existing. The convent was reprogramming her into a tool, a living doll existing only for others' desires. The winter solstice of 1228 was the final blow. This celebration was a showcase for patrons disguised as a religious festival. Marguerite, chosen as the main offering, was dressed as an angel, singing hymns while patrons circled like predators. Her role was to embody innocence being consecrated, a sick metaphor for what really happened. She had to thank each patron, beg for their attention, endure their blessings. The other kids watched, knowing their turn was coming. The system's genius was its ability to make kids complicit. Marguerite learned to anticipate patrons' desires, to compete for their approval, because it meant a sliver of safety. But it came at a cost. She was losing herself, piece by piece, to a machine that thrived on her suffering. The machine that consumed Marguerite wasn't just about breaking kids. It was about ensuring they could never fight back, never reclaim who they were. Every step, from the moment a child like Marguerite entered St. Agatha's to the moment they were disposed of, was calculated to strip away their humanity while maintaining the illusion of divine purpose. The convent wasn't a rogue operation. It was a cog in a continent-wide system that served the most powerful people in medieval Europe. And Marguerite's story shows us just how deep that system went, how it twisted everything it touched, from the kids to the nuns to the patrons who paid for it all. The psychological conditioning was relentless. Marguerite was told her family had rejected her, that they'd paid the convent to take her because she was unwanted. Forged letters, supposedly from her parents, hammered at home, expressing relief at being rid of her. The nuns enforced a ban on speaking her family's names, punishing any mention with beatings or worse. Over time, even thinking of her mother became a source of pain, a wound she learned to avoid. Her new name, Penitenta, was a constant reminder that her existence was a sin, that she owed the church everything. She was taught her every breath was a debt, a privilege the convent could revoke. The goal was to make her believe she was nothing outside their walls, a tool with no past and no future. Physical control was just as brutal. Shaving her head wasn't about humility, it was about vulnerability, catering to specific patron preferences. Keeping her barefoot in winter kept her weak, compliant, easier to manipulate. Regular health examinations were inspections, not care, with physicians assessing kids for suitability rather than treating ailments. The intake records are chillingly specific, detailing physical traits that had nothing to do with spirituality and everything to do with profit. Marguerite's beauty made her a high-value commodity, her file noting her exceptional appearance as a selling point. The daily routine was a cycle of fear and submission. Morning purification shocked kids awake with ice-cold baths, keeping them vulnerable. Confessions of imaginary sins reinforced their guilt. Couldn't think of sin? You'd be punished. You're suffering a lesson for the others. The silence rule prevented bonding or resistance. Supervised baths were for evaluation, with nuns and patrons assessing kids' bodies. Private spiritual examinations were the worst. Kids returned quiet, broken, their fear recorded as devotion. Marguerite learned to dread the sound of footsteps, the creak of a door, the shadow of a robe. The staff were part of the machine. Junior nuns had to prove their loyalty by participating in punishments, tying their silence to their survival. Senior nuns, like Mother Superior Agnes, managed the most valuable kids and patrons, their loyalty rewarded with power. Visiting clergy were treated like gods, their desires fulfilled no matter how monstrous. The record-keeping was meticulous. Each child's file detailed their physical and psychological state, their skills, and patron preferences. Marguerite's file called her suitable for advanced instruction, a euphemism for the worst abuses. She was inventory, nothing more. The underground chambers were the system's dark core. The lower levels had cells for kids who resisted or needed preparation. The middle levels were for patrons, with rooms equipped for acts that had no place in a house of God. The deepest level was for disposal. Kids who died or were too broken were buried in unmarked graves, their deaths recorded as eternal contemplation. Benedict's fate was a warning. 3 days of torture for trying to escape, leaving him a shell. He was gone, his body likely in one of those graves. The kids' resistance was heartbreakingly fragile. Their silent signals, gestures, objects left in specific places warned of danger. They taught Marguerite to go absent, to retreat into her mind during the worst moments. But the system was designed to crush even that. Rewards for compliance, better food, a blanket created dependency. Punishments for resistance hurt everyone. Marguerite learned to perform, serving wine with grace, singing hymns in specific poses, learning massage techniques for elderly nuns. The truth was uglier, and she knew it. By her second month, Marguerite was a shadow of herself. She stopped crying during private sessions. She smiled for selections, thanked patrons for their attention, begged forgiveness for existing. The convent was reprogramming her into a tool, a living doll existing only for others' desires. The winter solstice of 1228 was the final blow. This celebration was a showcase for patrons disguised as a religious festival, singing hymns while patrons circled. Her role was to embody innocence being consecrated, a sick metaphor for what really happened. She had to thank each patron, beg for their attention, endure their blessings. The other kids watched, knowing their turn was coming. The system's genius was its ability to make kids complicit. Marguerite learned to anticipate patrons' desires, to compete for their approval, because it meant a sliver of safety. But it came at a cost. She was losing herself, piece by piece, to a machine that thrived on her suffering. The patrons, like Cardinal Fipe, were the fuel, their wealth and power ensuring the system's survival. His letters, preserved in the Vatican archives, show a chilling casualness, referring to Marguerite as Item 47, praising her development, including a bonus for exceptional service. He wasn't an outlier. He was the norm, one of countless elites who kept the machine running. The system served the powerful, and that's why it lasted. The church needed the support of kings, nobles, and clergy, and the convents delivered what they wanted. The kids' suffering was sanctified, their religious status making them untouchable yet disposable. Secular authorities couldn't or wouldn't intervene. Families were too powerless to fight back. The kids were alone, except for each other, and even that was fragile. Marguerite's story doesn't end with her suffering. It ends with her erasure, a final act of cruelty that stripped her of even a memory. By the winter solstice of 1228, she was no longer the girl who'd arrived at St. Agatha's clutching her wooden doll. She was item 47, a product molded to serve the desires of men like Cardinal Fipe and his ilk. That night, during the so-called celebration, she was the centerpiece of a spectacle that blended religious ritual with systematic violation. Dressed as an angel, she sang hymns while patrons circled, picking their prey. Her role was to embody innocence being offered to God's representatives, a symbolic act that turned horrifyingly literal. She had to thank each patron, beg for their attention, endure their blessings. The other kids watched, knowing their turn was coming. The records describe her as achieving perfect spiritual submission that night, a polite way of saying she'd been completely broken. By March 15th, 1229, Marguerite's story ends in the convent's disposal ledger. Item 47, service completed, transferred to eternal contemplation. Modern historians believe this meant murder. Kids who reached total psychological collapse were often eliminated to make room for new victims. Marguerite's body was likely buried in the convent's consecrated ground, her grave marked only with her number. She was 7 years old, her entire existence reduced to a ledger entry. But Marguerite wasn't alone. The system that destroyed her consumed an estimated 40,000 kids across Europe over 400 years, from England's monastery schools to Italy's convent networks. The Vatican archives are filled with thousands of entries like hers, each one a life reduced to a number, a transaction, a grave. The records only exist because someone thought it was worth documenting, a chilling reminder that this wasn't hidden, it was business as usual. The church built a network that spanned the continent, with convents like St. Agatha's acting as hubs in a trade that profited from children's suffering. The patrons were the backbone of this system. Cardinal Fipe's letters show how deep it went. He'd specify which kids he wanted, how he wanted them prepared, and how much he'd pay. The patron lists include names that shaped medieval Europe: kings, nobles, clergy, merchants, scholars. Their involvement was protected by the church's immunity, the kids' religious status making them both sacred and disposable. Secular authorities were either complicit or powerless. Families were too poor or scared to fight back. The kids were alone, except for their fragile attempts to protect each other with silent signals and whispered warnings. The kids' resistance was heartbreaking. They used gestures and objects to warn of danger, taught each other to go absent during the worst moments. But the system was relentless, using rewards to create dependency and punishments to crush defiance. Marguerite learned to perform, to compete for patron approval because it meant survival. By the end, she was a shell, smiling on cue, thanking her abusers, begging forgiveness for existing. The winter solstice event was her final breaking point, a night that erased what little was left of her. The system lasted because it served the powerful. The church needed the support of men like Cardinal Fipe, whose letters show a chilling casualness about the kids he used. The patron lists are a roll call of medieval elites. People who built cathedrals, funded crusades, wrote laws. The kids' suffering was sanctified their religious status making them untouchable yet disposable. The system's collapse didn't come from justice. It came from change. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century cracked the church's grip, and rising literacy made it harder to keep secrets. Convents couldn't operate openly anymore, so they evolved into less visible forms. The cost was staggering: 40,000 kids, maybe more, erased from history. Their names were replaced with numbers, their graves unmarked, their stories buried in ledgers. The Vatican archives hold thousands of these stories, each one a child who deserved better. This isn't just a medieval horror story, it's a warning. The mechanisms that enabled this, unquestioned authority, economic incentives, institutional silence, are still with us. In 2024, an estimated 2 million kids worldwide face similar abuses in institutions cloaked in respectability, from boarding schools to religious camps. The tools have changed, digital records instead of quill pens, but the cruelty hasn't. We tell Marguerite's story because someone kept those records, someone preserved the evidence. Someone refused to let her disappear into oblivion. She wasn't item 47. She was a 7-year-old girl who loved her wooden doll, who deserved to grow up, to laugh, to live. Her story is a scream from the past, demanding we listen. We owe it to her, and to the thousands like her, to remember, not as numbers, but as kids with names, dreams, and lives that were stolen. This is WTF History, and we're here to give a voice to the silenced. If this story hit you as hard as it hit me, drop a comment below. Tell me what shocked you most, what made you angry, what you want to learn next. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next dive into the past. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.